Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. And today I have a very special guest, Martin Refalo. He is back on for the third time, and we were just chatting off air. It was episode, I think I said 14 and 36 was the last time he was on, and we kind of lost track of time there. We thought maybe that was
Yeah.
before COVID, but it actually wasn't. So
Yeah.
good sign that we've both been busy. But in case you guys are new listeners and you weren't around in the beginning, Martin is a coach based out of Australia with 8+ years of experience. He is also the education manager for JPS Health and Fitness, as well as a natural bodybuilder. And he is now a PhD student publishing research, which we'll chat about today. Lastly, he has an intense passion for the fitness industry and science behind training and nutrition. So Martin, welcome back on, man.
Thanks, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be back here speaking to you about topics that we're both passionate about. And yeah, I guess I still don't even know what year it would have been that we last spoke. I know you said it was episode 14 or something, but yeah, it's been a while, and I'm looking forward to have a good discussion with you again today.
Yeah, me too. I think it was probably late 2020 was probably when
Okay.
we last chatted. So obviously
Yeah.
you've had a lot go on since then. So almost 2 years
Yeah.
now. So really looking forward to dive into this. So I
Yeah.
guess to start it off, has there been really any like major updates for you? And we'll kind of dive into training and nutrition next, and maybe some studies. But I don't know if there was anything outside of that that maybe has happened for you over the last little bit.
Yeah, not so much. So I've been working at JPS as per usual, coaching face to face and online. And over that time, I guess since COVID, I've started my PhD. So currently researching muscle hypertrophy, and more specifically, the influence of proximity to failure on muscle hypertrophy. And over the past year or so, I've had the privilege of working with some great researchers, and we've been able to publish a couple papers, which has been really cool. And I've got more research coming through as well that should be published in the coming months. So I guess those are the major updates. I think the last time we spoke, I wouldn't have started my PhD. I would have probably been doing my master's, and so that's the major update. And yeah, I'm looking forward to pursuing and finishing my PhD over the next 1.5 to 2 years. So that's where I'm at the moment, still in the early days, if you will. And yeah, looking forward to getting more research out there and having great discussions about it all.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I, always respect people that are in the trenches doing research because it's not an easy process. So I guess my question to you is, since we haven't chatted since you started doing this, has it been more time consuming than you thought? Less? What have kind of been your experiences with that?
Yeah, definitely time consuming, especially when you're working on the side and you have more responsibilities on the side of the PhD. So really, with a PhD, they do expect you to do 38 hours per week, which is a full-time role. And of course, if you've got more hours that you need to do as part of your job to make money, you could imagine how that could be difficult over time to manage. I think I've done pretty well overall, though. I think I've been able to keep up with all my commitments, and I haven't really fallen behind, which is good. And I still think I've been able to give my all to the responsibilities, the jobs, the tasks that I need to do. I think over the years, I've become quite good at sensing when I may be doing too much and when I may be burning the candle at both ends. And so when I do get to that point, I know what I need to do to essentially safeguard myself from compromising any of the responsibilities, tasks, or jobs that I need to do. So my, I guess, commitments and responsibilities have been upheld, which is great. And of course, it's time consuming, but I've been able to put in the work and to continue slowly progressing, which is good. So my goal is to finish the PhD in 3 or so years. It seems like most people take longer to complete it. Because of the nature of research and running studies and just things being prolonged. But yeah, that is my goal, and hopefully in the coming years I'll be finished up, and yeah, it'll all be good.
Awesome. So you mentioned 38 hours. So what does like kind of a typical week look like for somebody that, maybe isn't familiar with like what
Mm,
a PhD student would be doing? What are you doing within those 38 hours throughout the week
yeah.
typically?
So the first 9 months was simply putting formulating ideas and putting pen to paper. So what do I want to research? What is the point of the research? And how am I actually going to execute this uh, in the real world, right? In the lab? How am I going to actually experiment and come to a conclusion about the things that I'm interested in? So really, the first 9 months was writing, a lot of writing, a lot of researching. The scoping review was essentially the idea of the scoping review was developed in the first 9 months, and it was constructed for the most part in the first 9 months too, and recently polished off for publication. And then after that 9 month period, it was a matter of designing and I guess confirming what I was going to do with my first experimental study. So really, in a PhD, for most people, you have to complete. You have to conduct 2 to 3 separate studies that make up your thesis and the overarching theme of the research. And so my first study, which we can speak about later, was looking at the influence of proximity to failure on neuromuscular fatigue. Now, I mentioned earlier that my main research interest is muscle hypertrophy, but as we know, all training that induces muscle hypertrophy also comes with some degree of neuromuscular fatigue. So after that first 9 month period, it was all about designing and really bulletproofing that first initial study looking at fatigue, which is an acute study. It was an acute study. Of course, with fatigue, we can measure it almost instantly, but muscle hypertrophy is a much longer process, right? You could imagine designing a study that looks at muscle hypertrophy would be quite time intensive. So a lot of planning, a lot of writing. Earlier this year, I did end up conducting that study out of JPS Health Fitness, which was really cool. And I was able to recruit some great participants for that. And now I'm pretty much back to the drawing board. I'm now designing a study for next year, looking at muscle hypertrophy, still thinking about how I want to approach it. And of course, I've always got other work in the background as well. So I'm now writing the manuscript. I'm writing the article for that study that I ran earlier this year. And I've got a whole bunch of other things going on in the background too. So that's essentially what things look like as a PhD student. You've always got something to work on in the background, and then you're always also trying to design that next study, because it takes time to design a study, right? It takes like it took me over a year to design and to bulletproof a 4 week study, right? And there's a lot that goes into it, especially when you want to, like, one of my goals is to improve the validity of research studies looking at resistance training outcomes like muscle hypertrophy, right? And to do that, you have to do a lot of research. You have to see what other people have done. You have to try and improve on that. You have to build off that. Uh, and then you have to work out a way to design a study where you are still going to be able to um, take practical applications away from it and then distribute that to the broad audience in an easy to understand manner. So lots of thinking that goes into it. And I feel like, just to summarize, a PhD is all about thinking, writing, and then speaking, right? Trying to distribute the knowledge that you've acquired and gained through your own original research.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, it is very time consuming. And like I said, I really admire people that do research because it is just a lot that goes into it that you don't really think about. Right. And then, you can do these studies. And then, like you said, you have to make sure the validity's there because you go
Mhm.
through all this process. And then maybe there's something that was off. And then
Yeah.
like you said, the validity's not there. So it's like, dang, that's, you spent a lot of time doing that. So again, really, really appreciate the work that you're doing there to obviously further this field. So I guess for you then, is there anything, so you said, so you did the scoping review, which we were going to chat about, and then you also had the uh I can't, sorry, I lost my train of thought here, the one where
Yeah.
training to failure on fatigue. You did that one.
Yep.
That was the
Yep.
more of the acute study. And then you said you're going to do
Yes.
one next year that is looking at, I'm sorry, that was muscle hypertrophy.
Yep. Yes, correct. So again, still in the early days when it comes to planning that study. Technically, I have already planned it, but since my previous plan, my thoughts have changed, right? So
Yeah, I'm
my
sure.
thoughts are ever evolving on the topic, and I want to take it in a slightly different direction. So that's something we can potentially speak about down the track. But I also have a meta-analysis currently going through peer review, and that's this meta-analysis is essentially taking all the current studies that look at muscle hypertrophy,
Mm-hmm.
that look at the influence of proximity to failure in muscle hypertrophy, and it's grouping them all together in separate themes and analyzing them to come to a conclusion about what we currently know when it comes to proximity to failure and muscle hypertrophy. So that's currently in peer review. That's something maybe we can touch on at some point. I'm sure it'll pop
Yeah.
up. And it's just important to know that when I speak about data that hasn't actually been through peer review yet and hasn't been confirmed through peer review, it's important that you interpret what I say with caution, because peer review is such a critical part of the research process. So, it's another part of the process that kind of extends the whole process, but it's so critical. And for those of you that don't know, when you do write a manuscript based on a study, before you publish it, before it actually is published, it goes through peer review. So multiple experts on the topic will review the paper, will review the manuscript, they'll provide feedback, they'll critique it, they'll make sure that the study methods were valid, right, are reliable. And before that is confirmed across multiple experts, the paper will not be published, right? So just something to keep in mind, and hopefully that all makes sense for the listeners.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful to let people know that, right? Because I think, again, people, I feel like with the abundance of information that's out there, people are able to look at studies and they can just look at the abstract and look at everything, and they don't really know what's going on and kind of the behind the
Mhm.
scenes of everything. So I think it is very important to make that, to let people know that there is a process to, ensure that these are valid. And like you said, the peer review
Sure.
process is super important. So I think last time we had you on, we talked about rep ranges effect on, I think it was uh, fatigue as well too. Is that
Yeah.
was that a paper that you potentially, was that what you did before?
I think the last time we spoke, we discussed the influence of load on hypertrophy. And of course, whenever you speak about the concept of load, you're also invoking rep ranges, because they go hand in hand. So that's what we touched on last time. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, but it was influence of resistance training load on measures of skeletal muscle hypertrophy and improvements in
yeah,
maximal strength and neuromuscular task performance.
that's the one.
Yep. So if
Yep.
anybody's interested in that, episode 36 to go back. So I
Yeah.
also wanted to talk about, an update on your training and nutrition. Now, obviously
Yeah.
you're putting in a ton of hours here with the PhD. I'm assuming you're still probably doing a little bit of coaching and then some work for JPS
Yeah.
as well on top of it.
Yeah.
So how does that look like for you currently?
Yeah. So look, I guess I have spent the best part of the last month living out of a suitcase. I have spent in the last month 2 weeks in Europe. So there was a exercise science conference in Spain, which I had the privilege to attend and to present at.
Awesome.
That conference was organized by the European College of Sports Science. So I spent 2 weeks in Spain, and I just got back from a week in Singapore. So me and some of my colleagues from JPS went to Singapore. There was a conference there too, and we also had some work to do in Singapore. We ran one of our science to gym floor seminars. So over that 3 week period, my training consisted of whatever I could do in the gyms that were available to me. Luckily, all the hotels that we stayed at, that I stayed at in Europe, had a gym. I made sure that was the case. And one of my hotels luckily had a hamstring curl and a leg extension machine. as soon as I saw that, I was like, oh, great. Like I'm not losing any muscle mass in my legs. I think there was one session where I did just 5 sets of leg extensions, 5 sets of hamstring curls, and that was most of my leg volume for the week. But yeah, I've been able to keep up my training, no doubt. It probably hasn't been over the past 6 months, my training hasn't been the best it's ever been, but that's fine. I know how to adjust expectations and distribute my energy wisely to
Yeah.
all the different commitments and responsibilities I've had. And yeah, I think over the past month I've done well to simply maintain my muscle mass and to keep a somewhat consistent training routine going. I've still trained 3 to 4 times a week over the past month, even though I've only been at home for really a matter of days. And of course, nutrition wise, across the last month has also been a bit of a learning curve. I've been able to maintain my weight really well. I jumped on the scale the other day actually, and I was only 500 grams up my pre-Spain weigh-in, my pre-Europe weigh-in. So essentially I've maintained. I'm not sure if we can even call that weight gain, and that's promising because I had actually lost about 6 kilos leading into the Europe trip, and so the fact that I was able to maintain that with no tracking, essentially eating out every single day. All my meals were from restaurants. I think that was, to come back home and to see that I've maintained my weight is a good result based on, the month that I have had.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm sure that's probably years of experience right there where you're just able to moderate that much better. And so I guess for
Yeah.
you, you've just kind of been maintaining, I guess that you ran a little cut before was that a planned cut, planned weight loss before that as
Yeah.
well, knowing that you were going
Yeah.
to be traveling for a little bit of time, or that was just kind of time for you to run a cut?
Yeah, a bit of both, to be honest. A bit of both. So I think it probably I lost 6 kilos over a longer time period. So it was an intermittent approach that I took where I had some weeks of maintenance in between. So it was a slower approach. I just thought it was time to cut, and of course summer is just around the corner, so it lined up really well, and yeah, it all came together in the end.
It's pretty crazy to hear you say summer's right around the corner, because obviously here in the
Hmm.
States, it's like summer just is winding
Yeah.
down. So it's the complete opposite. It's weird to think that that's
Yeah.
actually a thing, but
Sure.
yeah, cool. And then for you, before that, was it kind of just in a surplus, trying to purposely gain weight, or what did that period look like for you?
Yeah, so I guess over the past year, like my focus at all time points with training is to build muscle,
Hmm.
right? In anticipation of one day returning to the stage. Like I said, over the past 6 to 12 months, training hasn't been the best it's ever been. I think I spent probably 2 years from 2020, maybe 2019 to 2021, throughout that period training with Sam from JPS, a training partner. We did a whole bunch of training that was super productive, and as my PhD started to ramp up, it just started to get harder to stick to training times that we could both coordinate over the week. And I'd love to get back to that point soon enough. But as we probably all experienced, when other commitments start to take over, it really is hard to manage the level of training intensity and frequency and consistency required to promote muscle growth, especially as quite an advanced individual in the gym. Like I've been in the gym now for over 10 years. So I look forward to the next few months. I don't have any travel planned. I don't have anything major in the way here. I don't really have to run a study. I think when I ran that study earlier this year, I spent literally every day in the gym. And this is not an exaggeration. When I say every day, I mean Monday to Sunday. I spent every day in the gym for 2 months with probably 1 or 2 days off, like less than a handful of days off over that 2 month period. Because I simply had participants coming in every single day, and it was up to me to work around their times, right? So that's just a bit of insight into how, I guess, time consuming and intensive running a study can be, especially when you're on your own. It was just me taking participants through their protocols. So I look forward to the next few months. I look forward to ramping training back up again, especially going now into 2023.
Awesome. Yeah, appreciate that review of everything. So let's dive into the topic. I wanted to bring you on here to talk about training to failure, just because I feel like this gets talked about all the time, right? Like I'll get questions, do you need to train to failure? Do we not need to? And I think there's just a lot of confusion around it. And obviously you're
Mhm.
in the research right now, so you have a very good understanding. So I thought you'd be perfect to bring on here to chat about. So I know, like you said, you've done a couple, you did a scoping review, you did your own study on it. So I don't know if you maybe want to start. Originally we were going to talk about the scoping review, but then you mentioned that you did do that study that obviously is
Mhm.
not published yet. So I don't know if there was one that you wanted to start. We said we might start with the scoping review first, and so maybe start there, and I'll
Correct.
kind of hand it over to you now on this.
Yeah, for sure. So early this year, I published a scoping review, as you know. So if you're listening to this, be sure to check it out if you want to know more. But really, the point of the scoping review was to lay a foundation for my future research. The point of the scoping review was to overview the available literature and come to a conservative conclusion about what we currently know regarding the influence of proximity to failure on muscle hypertrophy, what we don't know based on the current literature and its limitations, and what the best way forward really is. So like you said, Jeff, training to failure gets talked about a lot. And from my perspective, I want to be able to give a scientific overview of the topic. And I want people to better understand science. So you mentioned that I am, deep in the research, and that's true because I'm currently going through research training as a PhD student. But it's really important to understand that science doesn't simply equal research. So research is just one feature of the scientific endeavor. And my goal is to read and interpret research through a scientific lens. So you can read research, you can read abstracts, you can read conclusions, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're doing so scientifically. So the whole point of the scoping review was to put this information out there and speak about how we have to potentially interpret research in a more improved way, especially when it comes to the research pertaining to proximity to failure, because there are a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of variability and ambiguity across the studies that are commonly discussed in the industry. So, one of the things you also mentioned when you said that lots of people speak about training to failure and they want to know whether they should be training to failure or not. This is a great example that highlights a bit of a gap between research and practice. So, in research, many of the studies that I overviewed as part of the scoping review, many of those studies compared failure and non-failure training, right? And I guess what we can say about that is they are looking at the influence of proximity to failure on hypertrophy, but they're doing so by comparing a group training to failure and a group not training to failure. So essentially what researchers do is they design specific research questions and they dichotomize failure and non-failure training. They pull them apart so that they can determine if one is better than the other. But that doesn't mean in practice that we have to do the same, right? In practice, we don't ever have to train just to failure or just to non-failure, right? In practice, we can train with a whole host of different proximities to failure. And of course, I get that question asked a lot as well. Should I be training to failure or not to failure? And the answer to that is simply you don't have to do either one. You have to find a way to incorporate both into your resistance training program. And you don't have to go ahead and do what researchers are doing as part of their experiments, right? Because that's research. And over here, we have practice. You have to find a way to bridge that gap. And that's what I'm trying to do. So what I found upon looking at all the available literature on this topic was that there was variability across studies, which I mentioned earlier, and this variability was relevant to the definitions of failure applied across studies, and also the set termination methods used to control non-failure training, right? And this is really important to understand. So I split all the studies up into 3 themes. And if you read the paper, you'll have a better understanding as to how I exactly did that. But for example, there were a certain number of studies that applied the definition of momentary muscular failure, right? So they had a group of participants trained to failure and a non-failure group as well. But with that failure group, the researchers actually explicitly described how failure was controlled. And that's really good because upon reading some studies, there is no mention of how failure was actually controlled, right? So researchers might say this group trained to failure, right? And I'm very skeptical about that vague description. But what I found was that momentary muscular failure seemed to be the most objective way of controlling set termination. I think that stands its ground both in practice and in research. And we can define that as the point where, despite attempting to do so, the individual is unable to complete the concentric portion of the repetition with a full range of motion, right? And without deviation, without technical deviation. So what this means, Jeff, is that momentary muscular failure is involuntary, and this is really the cornerstone feature of an objective definition of failure. It's the fact that it's involuntary. So you don't actually choose when failure takes place. It happens involuntarily when you simply can't meet the force demands of the external load at a given point throughout the range of motion. And so those are the studies that I have a high degree of confidence in because I know how failure was controlled. And of course, I had another 2 themes of studies that didn't control the failure point as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that the variability between these studies also pertains to the non-failure groups, right? And if you look at non-failure groups across studies, what you see is that the way the set termination point is controlled is sometimes comes across as being somewhat arbitrary and sometimes also ambiguous. So what I mean by this is that non-failure training can mean a whole host of proximities to failure. Jeff, if I told you to go into the gym and not train to failure, you would have no idea what to do. Like, okay, I'll just start a set and I'll stop whenever I feel like it. That's clearly not the best approach to resistance training. And so a lot of the studies, for example, that look at the influence of proximity to failure on neuromuscular fatigue, a lot of the researchers, what they do is they have that failure group. That failure group is training to some definition of failure. And then the non-failure group is stopping their sets, is terminating their sets when they have achieved 50% of the maximal repetitions possible. So a common setup or study design might be, okay, we have a failure group here that are doing, the participants are doing 3 sets of 12 reps with a 12 rep maximum load, right? So the load that they can do for 12 reps, and supposedly they're reaching failure at that 12th rep. But again, in practice, I'm not sure if that's going to hold up on every single set. I'm not sure if that's going to hold up across numerous protocols. That's why I'd much rather just say, hey, we're going to do a set with a given load and we're going to push it to momentary muscular failure, as opposed to tying a participant down, tying a client down to a certain number of reps, right? Hey, you have to do 12 reps. Well, a client may be able to do 12 reps, and even if you're using what you thought was a 12 rep maximum load, maybe they're going to adapt. Maybe they're going to get to the point where they do 12 reps and they still have like one in the tank. That's just an example of how it can vary over time. And so many of these studies take that approach for the failure group. That's the approach they employ to control set termination in the failure group. And then the non-failure group would be simply doing 3 sets of 6 reps with their 12 rep maximum load, right? So we now have 3 sets, 3 times 12 RM versus 3 times 6 RM. And you might say, well, the non-failure group has 6 reps left in reserve. Yeah, that might be to some degree an accurate statement to make, but that's also going to vary. Like the true proximity to failure is going to vary across sets and over protocols. And the reason I'm describing this study design is because if we look at the available literature as a whole, and we look at all of these studies that assess proximity to failure and its influence on neuromuscular fatigue, the conclusion is that training to failure is more fatiguing than non-failure training. But many of these studies have different set termination points in those non-failure groups. And so non-failure can mean so many things. And to provide a robust practical recommendation, we need to be more specific about the proximity to failure achieved in these non-failure groups, right? Jeff, I'd much rather tell you to go into the gym and potentially try to keep 2 reps in reserve when you're training, right? That would be a more specific and a more direct way of providing you with a practical recommendation versus just saying, hey, go to the gym and don't train to failure, right? So that's where the state of the literature just briefly is currently at. We need to be able to better define failure in research and practice, and I think we're on the way to doing so. And we need to find ways to better control the proximity to failure achieved in non-failure conditions, so we can make more reliable comparisons between groups, and then take the conclusions away, take the results away, and provide robust practical recommendations that people can then go ahead and use in practice. So that's where I'm currently at, and that's what I attempted to do. That was the goal of my experimental study that we may speak about soon, and that will be the goal of my future research as well.
Awesome. Yeah. So it sounds like basically scoping review was just to kind of see where everything was at. And then you could kind of basically from there, it's like, okay, now I know where we need to go from here in order to, again, get more concrete, practical advice for people. But it sounds like
Correct.
really when it comes down to it, failure, there's probably better setup for failure because there's actually that like endpoint that you can get to. Whereas like with non-failure, it's just kind of like, don't really know how far away, and like it could
Sure.
theoretically be super far away from failure, and that's going to kind of make everything a little cloudy in terms of what the recommendations are for that. Because again, like you
Correct.
said, you're not going to tell somebody like, hey, don't train to failure, and then it's going to be 6+ reps away. We know that likely isn't going to be as good for hypertrophy versus going to
Correct.
failure.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I guess that's the lens that you have to interpret this research with. And I guess this might be a good segue for the experimental study that I conducted, which was an acute study. I think we mentioned that earlier. And the goal here was to look at the influence of proximity to failure on neuromuscular fatigue. Okay, hence why it's an acute study. So I think we were talking off air how assessing muscle hypertrophy would be a much more prolonged process. So you can measure fatigue almost instantly. It's an acute measurement that we're taking. Whereas with muscle hypertrophy, especially in the sample or in the population that I want to work with, I want to focus on resistance trained individuals. If we're looking at muscle hypertrophy outcomes in resistance trained individuals, we need a much longer time span. So in my acute study, what I did was I compared different proximities to failure, and I had 3 conditions primarily. I had one condition which required participants to perform resistance training to momentary muscular failure, as per the definition I described earlier. And the other two conditions involve participants resistance training to a 1 RIR and a 3 RIR, right? So I'm hoping that based on the results of this study, we can be a bit more specific about the practical recommendations, because I'm now making an effort to more clearly describe how set termination is being controlled in the non-failure groups. And I'm making an effort to try my best to control it as well. So that's where I want my future research to be taken, in that direction. I think subjective repetitions in reserve for RIR prediction is the most practical and easy to implement method uh, in practice, right? It's the most practical method to implement in practice, because it doesn't require any velocity tracking. It's just simple, and if you can train someone up, you can get them to the point where they are quite accurate with their predictions, and over time they're more accurate than they are inaccurate. Well, that's a big thumbs up, because that gives you a lot of flexibility and ownership over your own training. I think lots of people speak about the limitations of RIR and how it's subjective in nature, but I think the beauty is in the subjectivity, right? It gives you the ability to it gives you ownership, sorry. It gives you the ability to be in control of your own training. And if you aim to improve your predictive ability over time, well, your training will excel over time. I've had great success with individuals who have initially come to me not knowing anything about RIR, but eventually getting to the point where they know a lot about RIR and getting to the point where they can accurately predict and terminate their sets on their own accord. And as a coach, that gives me the ability to prescribe a certain number of reps, gives me the ability to prescribe a rep range, and I kind of leave the load selection and on the client, like that's on them, and I'll prescribe RIR target, and they can then deal with set termination on their own. And I try my best to get them to the point where I'm confident in their RIR predictions. And of course, to get there, you have to train to failure, right? That is like a prerequisite. You have to experience that point of failure, momentary muscular failure, on the given exercises that are in your program. And again, that's another reason why it doesn't make sense to just say, well, you never have to train to failure,
Right.
right? So right now, if you look at the conclusions of the scoping review, one of my main conclusions was that training to momentary muscular failure is likely not superior to non-failure training for muscle hypertrophy, right? That's all I could conclude based on my interpretation of the studies without statistically analyzing the results. And so, although that is the case, although you likely don't have to be training to failure on every set to maximize muscle hypertrophy, that is not to say that you never have to train to failure, because there are practical reasons, practical benefits of training to failure, which, for example, one of those benefits might be improving your subjective RIR prediction, right? So my future studies will hopefully also employ subjective RIR prediction, because that, like I said, that's probably the most practical and easy to implement method in practice. And so if we have more research looking into RIR prediction and employing it, well, I can only expect the practical recommendations to be better over time. And you might also hear some kickback when it comes to subjective RI prediction. So yes, it's subjective, and some people are inaccurate, and some people are horrible when it comes to predicting their RIR. But it's important to be specific when making these claims. So, for example, much of the research showing individuals are inaccurate with their RIR predictions is in untrained individuals, right? Now, of course, when you're working with an untrained person, I would not recommend just simply giving out numbers and RIR values and saying, hey, you need to train to a 1 RIR. It takes time to work up to that point. And there's methods you can employ before specifically giving someone an RIR value that will help them better improve their perceptions of proximity to failure. And so in research, like there are things you can implement to bulletproof the study, or at least safeguard the the study from the limitation of RIR prediction inaccuracies, right? So, for example, in my acute study, I recruited resistance trained individuals, right? And we already know resistance trained individuals are better than untrained individuals in predicting their RIR. That's already one thing that we can implement to try and safeguard ourselves from that limitation of inaccurate predictions. So, for example, the sample that I recruited on average between the men and women, they had about 7 to 8 years of resistance training experience. Um, Pretty much all participants also had RIR experience, so they were familiar with RIR predictions. We also used a heavy load, so 75% of 1RM, and we know that most people are more accurate with their RIR predictions when lifting a heavier load versus a lighter load, right? So there are things we can do to increase the chances of the participants or the client's RIR predictions being accurate. So although there are limitations to using this approach, and of course there can still be variability in the true proximity to failure achieved across participants. Like if I tell 20 people to stop at a 3 RIR, of course there will still be some variability, but it's a lot better than just saying, hey, we're doing a non-failure training approach here. You're going to stop when you have 50% of the maximum repetitions possible, and that's how we're going to control non-failure training. So just thought I would, I guess, preface the rest of the conversation with that information.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. So basically what you're trying to say there is like you've kind of gone through the process to really eliminate the potential errors of RAR here with this by
Exactly.
doing those things that you talked about. So that way, again, this adds to the validity of the study, because like you said, I think one of the big criticisms of RAR is like, oh, well, for what you basically said there, where it's like people are probably far away from failure, or further away from failure than what they think they are. But again, like you said, that's mostly in untrained individuals. And so you, by basically in this study, making sure that they were trained individuals, that obviously lowered that. And then again, one of the other ones was that I remember is the further, like the more reps you have to do, the tougher it is to kind of gauge your RAR as well too, the lighter the load. Whereas, and again,
Correct.
you made sure that they were doing at least 75% of, I think 1RM is what it was. And so that again is going to increase the validity of the RAR here in this study.
Exactly. And to take it one step further, I also employed what I call an extended familiarization period before the study actually commenced. So although all my participants were resistance trained, they'd all experienced failure before, they were all familiar with RIR prediction as well. They completed 2 familiarization sessions before the study commenced, which required them to perform resistance training to momentary muscular failure. So the exercise that I used in this acute study was a barbell bench press, right? So they performed 2 sets to momentary muscular failure on 2 separate occasions, right? To understand what it actually feels like to essentially be stuck with the barbell over your chest. Every single set ended with me grabbing the barbell off a participant's chest, or maybe like, halfway through the range of motion when they were completely stuck. And obviously I helped them re-rack it. That was the failure point. And across those 2 sessions, I also got the individuals to practice predicting their RIR. So an example of this would be me telling you, Jeff, that you're about to do a set to momentary muscular failure on the barbell bench press, and that I want you to yell out when you think you have 1 rep in reserve, right? And so you'd start the set, you'd yell out when you think you have 1 rep in reserve, and then you'd continue pushing to failure. And of course, we can then look at your perception of the 1 RIR, right? How accurate that was, right? Because we are then performing the subsequent reps all the way to failure. And so that is the gold standard way of assessing how accurate someone actually is with their RIR predictions. And I did that with both the 1 and the 3 RIR. And again, that's just me trying to increase the chances of my participants being accurate in the study with their predictions. And in that familiarization period, what I found was that most participants were actually quite accurate, right? And it wasn't really a surprise to me, because I know that if you can get to a point where, if you can get a client to a point where they are quite experienced and they have practiced predicting their RIR over time, they've trained to failure, I know it can be quite accurate, right? Uh, on average, when participants were predicting a 1 RIR across those 2 sessions, they were less than half a rep away from the RIR target, right? So less than half a rep away, which is quite accurate. So in most cases, they were meeting that 1 RIR target, and in some cases, they might have been at like a 2, maybe a 0, maybe they overshot the set, maybe they undershot the set. And with the 3 RIR target, they were just under 1 rep away. And as we know as well, the closer you get to failure, the easier it is to
Yeah.
predict accurately. So those were expected results, and I think they're quite promising. And I think that goes to show that you can implement, subjective RIR prediction in research, and you can most definitely implement it in practice. It's really just a tool, and it's really on the coach to use the tool wisely. Like I said, it wouldn't be wise to use this approach with someone who stepped foot into the gym for the first time. But that doesn't mean in 6 months' time that they won't be ready,
To use them.
right, to use the tool.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I love too that, again, you made sure you did your best to set up to where the RIR was going to be reliable, but then again, you took it a step further and had them do I don't know how long the phase was before that, but again, to get them
Mhm,
familiar with it as well,
mhm,
and to just kind of gauge how accurate they were with everything. So again, it was another
mhm,
thing, and it seems like the closer they were to failure, it was accurate, a little bit more accurate. And then, like you said, once they got to 3 RIR, it's like now they were like
mhm.
within a rep, still very close,
Exactly.
but it started to go up a little bit. Cool. I think that's a great introduction into this. So I guess maybe now kind of dive into maybe the specifics, and also you are the only one doing this as well. You're the one that kind of, you're with the people doing this. You're watching
Mhm,
them do these sets and everything like
mhm.
that. And you're the only one, or you had some help with you as well.
Yeah, so it was just me. Like I said, I spent pretty much every day
Okay.
in the gym for over 2 months,
That makes sense
taking
now.
participants through the sessions. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, completely supervised. And like I said, the main focus, so if we're diving to the specifics now, was to look at the effects of these 3 different conditions on neuromuscular fatigue, right? So 3 RIR, 1 RIR, and momentary muscular failure. And again, the reason I'm interested in neuromuscular fatigue is because the hard training that is necessary to induce muscle hypertrophy will also induce fatigue. And I think there's a relationship between fatigue and at least mechanical tension, right?
Yeah.
So what I mean by this, like if we really take time to overview and understand neuromuscular fatigue for the listeners, neuromuscular fatigue can occur both centrally and peripherally. So what I mean by this is when we are contracting musculature, reason we can contract is because the brain, the central nervous system, is sending a signal to the muscle, right? And central fatigue would refer to a decrease in neural drive, or more specifically, a decrease in the strength of the signal being sent to the muscle, right? So that's just one way fatigue can accumulate over the course of a session. And of course, if the strength of the signal is weakened, then the degree of force that a muscle fiber can produce is also going to decrease, right? And we refer to this as muscle fiber excitation. So the signal being sent from the central nervous system to the muscle fiber, that action potential that innervates the muscle fiber, and that's known as excitation. Now, if we look at the muscle fiber itself, like I said, neuromuscular fatigue can also occur peripherally, which just refers to any fatigue occurring within the muscle fiber, distal to the neuromuscular junction. This would now be describing the activation of the muscle. So we have the excitation of the muscle via the central nervous system, which then prompts the muscle to be activated. And this primarily occurs through calcium release that allows a cross bridge cycle to take place, right? So that's that's activation of the muscle fiber. And intramuscular perturbations in metabolite concentration and energy depletion, that can impair the fiber's ability to produce force, right? That's likely due to the fact that the process of activation is now being impaired. And this primarily occurs through disruptions in calcium kinetics. So when metabolite concentration is perturbed and the energy within the muscle fiber is being depleted, the muscle fiber can be less sensitive to calcium, and the calcium concentration within the fiber itself can be disturbed, and that's going to affect the force production of the muscle. Now, mechanical tension really can be simply described as the amount of force that a certain area of muscle fiber is experiencing. And so if we have neuromuscular fatigue acting on our muscle fibers throughout a resistance training session, and we are trying to achieve maximum mechanical tension possible, right, to build muscle, we can see how there may be an interaction between neuromuscular fatigue, mechanical tension, and the subsequent muscle hypertrophy that takes place after training, right? So that's why I wanted to look at first, how does proximity to failure influence neuromuscular fatigue? So that's, I guess, a bit of an overview of the thought process behind the study. And like I mentioned earlier, I had both men and women. I think I mentioned that earlier. And that's important because previous research has highlighted that there may be a sex difference in neuromuscular fatigue ability, right? But we don't have much research that specifically looks at how proximity to failure may moderate that sex difference between men and women. So a lot of the previous research shows that there are some sex-related characteristics which may make women less fatigable than men, and I wanted to look at that as well. So I had 24 participants all up, 12 men, 12 women. They were all resistance trained, and each of them performed or completed each of the conditions I mentioned earlier. So it was a within subject design, which is a very powerful study design because each participant acted as their own control, right? They all did all three conditions at separate time points over a 4 or so week period. Like I mentioned as well, the barbell bench press was the exercise being performed, and the protocol consisted of 6 sets with 75% of 1 rep max, right? The only thing that differed across conditions was the RIR, right? Or the set termination point, right? So each time the participants walked into the gym, they did 6 sets on the barbell bench press with 75% of 1 rep max, 4 minutes of rest in between sets, and they terminated their sets either when they reached momentary muscular failure or when they subjectively predicted that they had reached a 1 or a 3 RIR. So that was the study design. And of course, with that study design, what we can do is we can then compare each condition and look at how proximity to failure influenced the outcomes, because all the other variables are controlled for, right? The load is the same, the number of sets performed is the same, the rest period is the same, the technique individuals are using is the same, etc. So very powerful study design. Now, you might ask, well, how was neuromuscular fatigue actually measured? That's a really good question. There's multiple ways in which we can measure fatigue in the gym. I think one of the most practical ways, which as coaches, we intuitively employ when working with clients, that's lifting velocity. So looking at changes in lifting velocity over time, right? So let me give you an example. Jeff, if I put 60 kilos on the barbell bench press and I told you to do 3 reps with that 60 kilos, I could measure the speed of the reps, and that's exactly what I did with a velocity tracker. I could measure the speed of those 3 reps. I could then put you through a workout, right? So let's say you push that 60 kilos at a meter a second. That was your speed. And then I put you through a chest workout and we did a few exercises. And then we came back to that same load on the bench press and I made you do another 3 reps. We would expect a decrease in your lifting velocity, right? Which we can simply describe as the velocity of that concentric portion of the rep, like how fast you're able to push it off your chest, right? It might be 0.8 meters a second. And if you went from a meter a second to 0.8 meters a second, we can we can look at the difference there and quantify that as some degree of neuromuscular fatigue, right? The larger the decrement in your lifting velocity with a given load, with a fixed load, the more neuromuscular fatigue present. That seems to be a valid way of measuring neuromuscular fatigue. And again, in practice, that's something we implement as coaches. And that's why I wanted to take it into the research setting and quantify it with a velocity tracker. Of course, in research, we can't just use our coach's eye to quantify neuromuscular fatigue. But in practice, like if I know a client should be lifting a weight faster because I work with them 3 times a week, but they're not, right? My first point of call is going to be, well, hey, did you sleep enough last night? Like, you seem a bit fatigued. How's your nutrition been, etc. Right? So that's how I measured neuromuscular fatigue. Essentially, before each protocol, participants had to lift a given load for 3 reps, and this was standardized across participants. And then after the 6 sets that we completed, the participants then had to lift that same load, right, the pre-exercise load, for 3 reps, right? And we looked at the difference in velocity from pre-exercise to immediately post-exercise. And then we also looked at how fatigued they were 24 and 48 hours after the protocol itself. So participants came back into the gym 24 and 48 hours later. I put that same load on the bar, they warmed up, and they pushed it as fast as they could for 3 reps. And with that information, I was able to develop a recovery time course for each participant, right? Where are we at pre-exercise? How fatigued are we immediately post-exercise? And then how much recovery have we experienced in the days subsequent to the protocol? And I think that's a really cool way of just looking at the effects of proximity to failure on neuromuscular fatigue. So that was one of the outcome measures, and of course we looked at like the decrease in repetitions across sets. Of course, if you lose more reps across sets, you're likely more fatigued, and as an individual, you're likely more fatigable than another individual who may actually be quite consistent with their reps, and they may only experience a slight decrease. And we also looked at, for example, how lifting velocity changed from set to set, right? If you do six sets in a row, you can imagine that the latter sets would be performed with a slower lifting velocity on average than the former sets. So again, these are all ways we can measure neuromuscular fatigue. And the good thing is they're all practical measures as well. We can use all of these in practice. If I have a client who is training to a 1 RIR and they're losing rep upon rep upon rep every single set, and they just seem to be getting fatigued exponentially from set to set, well, my initial thoughts would be, well, okay, this person seems to be quite fatigable. Maybe we should step slightly further away from failure to preserve more of their performance, depending on their goals, etc. Right? So that's just an overview of again my thought process leading to the study design itself. And when it comes to the results for the most part are what I expected. So again, just important to interpret what I say with caution, because I'm still writing the manuscript and will hopefully be published in the coming months. It needs to go through peer review. But what I found was what seemed to be a linear effect of proximity to failure on neuromuscular fatigue. Right? As coaches, this is something we intuitively know. Like, we know that pushing closer to failure likely comes with more fatigue. It's likely a dose response effect. But again, if we look at the previous research that I overviewed in my scoping review, for example, we can't use that research to make that claim. Like, we can't make a research-based claim with the previous literature because of the variability, the ambiguities that I mentioned. And so this was a way for me to design a study that was novel, right, in its design, and that would then allow us to take better practical recommendations away, like I mentioned earlier. So it seemed that the momentary muscular failure condition induced a lot more fatigue than the 1 RIR and the 3 RIR condition, especially in that immediate post-exercise period. So right after 6 sets performed, we can turn this acute neuromuscular fatigue, right? That seemed to increase in somewhat of a linear manner as we got closer to failure, right? So that's good, right? That's what we intuitively thought would take place. That was my hypothesis, and that's what I picked up upon looking at all the data and analyzing it. Now, when we look at the 24 and 48 hour time points, which would not be classified as acute neuromuscular fatigue anymore, right? Because we have now experienced some degree of recovery. What I found was that most participants were close to fully recovered at the 24-hour period, and definitely at the 48-hour period. And we didn't really see any major differences between conditions at those time points. That's just a brief statement. And that's likely because the protocol itself maybe just wasn't fatiguing enough to lead to decrements or impairments in force production 24 and 48 hours later. And that's fine. That can maybe set up a future study design where the protocol itself is more extensive. But for the most part, I'm based on the results, I'm interested in, okay, well, what happens in this session, right? And how can the neuromuscular fatigue that you pick up in a session, how can that affect the mechanical tension that you're also trying to achieve, and then the subsequent muscle hypertrophy afterwards. So that was like the primary result. And if we then split the sample of participants into men and women, what we see is also a trend for women being less fatigable. So on average, women experience a less lifting velocity loss over the course of 6 sets. They didn't lose as much of their lifting velocity. And upon training to failure, they didn't seem to experience the same degree of acute neuromuscular fatigue right after the session versus men. And this is something that I've anecdotally observed working with many men, many women. And like I mentioned, previous research has hypothesized and has put forth physiological mechanisms that may underlie a sex difference in neuromuscular fatigue. But again, it hasn't been really studied through the lens of proximity to failure. So I think the results of this study provide a unique insight into the potential differences in neuromuscular fatigability between sexes, and again, something that we can consider further in practice when we're working with men and women. But of course, I think what we should be more focused on is not necessarily just looking at the sex difference and saying, hey, all women are less fatigable than men, because some of my female participants were experiencing more fatigue than some of the male participants, right? It just seems that when we look at group averages, that's the way it played out. But individual fatigability should really take precedence in practice when we're working with clients. And of course, all the things I mentioned earlier, like all the measures of fatigue that I described earlier, they're all practical measures. We can look out for them in practice, and we can assess to some extent someone's individual fatigability and use that to inform programming related decisions.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, really good summary of that. And again, the design was awesome. And again, it sounds like you found some really good information. So I guess a couple questions I have on it is, would you say then that I think some people might hear this and think oh, all fatigue is bad, we want to kind of avoid it. What are kind of your thoughts on that? Because we know that is going to just be a byproduct of pushing yourself. So what would be some things there with that? Are we looking to try to avoid fatigue as much as we can? Where can we kind of take this information that we got from this and maybe apply it to a program or something like that?
I think that's a great question. And I think to try and answer that question and provide some practical examples, Jeff, if you told me you could only do one set of leg press, right, in your leg session, that's all you had time for, that's all that you could manage, just one set on the leg press to grow your quads, and you ask me how hard you should be pushing that set, my answer would be train to failure. You have to push that set to failure if you want to maximize the mechanical tension stimulus imparted across the quadriceps, right? You need to train to failure because you're only doing one set. And yes, you're going to accumulate neuromuscular fatigue along the way, but there really is no negative consequence of that neuromuscular fatigue, because after that one set, your workout is done. But on the other hand, if you told me that you could now perform, 6 to 8 sets on the leg press, my answer would change. And this is why it's not as simple as just asking the question of how hard should we train in the gym, or should we train to failure or not failure? Because my answer is going to be adaptive, right? It's going to be based on individual context. And of course, when we're speaking on a podcast from speaking to a group of individuals, I have to give more of a broad answer that is going to be applicable to the whole audience. And that's why I like to provide these examples, because how hard you train or how close to failure you push your sets needs to be dependent on a whole host of variables, right? My goal when programming for clients is to ensure that we are achieving a sufficient stimulus to maximize hypertrophy over the course of a workout. And to do that, I do think you have to at least limit neuromuscular fatigue. So this doesn't mean that we try to minimize it as much as we possibly can. No. Well, if that's the case, you just do like train to like a 5 RIR. Like that's probably not going to be sufficient. Train to a 5 RIR on every single set. That's likely not going to induce a sufficient stimulus to maximize hypertrophy, right? So if we look at a workout as a whole and we kind of zoom out, right, we're going to have multiple exercises spread across a workout. We're going to have, generally multi-joint exercises first, single joint exercises last, just on a basic level. The proximity to failure, if I'm speaking to a broad audience and I'm giving a broad recommendation, like you should probably start your session off training slightly further from failure and then finish it training closer to failure, right? You could imagine, Jeff, if I told you to start your leg session off doing 3 sets to failure on a leg press, could you imagine how that would affect the rest of your workout, right? The degree of neuromuscular fatigue you incur doing that will arguably affect the level of mechanical tension you can achieve on your split squats and your leg extensions coming up. You simply wouldn't be able to produce the force and the mechanical tension that you would otherwise produce if maybe you kept 2 or 3 reps in reserve on the leg press, right? So we really have to think about how proximity to failure influences mechanical tension, not just in one set, right? If we're just looking at one set, like I mentioned earlier, Jeff, train to failure. If that's all you're doing, push to failure. But if we're now looking at multiple sets, well, we have to zoom out and consider how the relationship may change over time. And like I mentioned, there are this cloud of neuromuscular fatigue that starts to accumulate over the course of a session, right? That can affect your ability to produce force and maximize mechanical tension. So all I'm saying is that we have to be strategic with the way we prescribe proximity to failure so that we can get the most out of the session as a whole, and then ensure we can come back to the gym tomorrow, the day after, and not be compromised by that cloud of neuromuscular fatigue that may still be lingering, right? It may not be lingering to a great extent in the subsequent days after a session, but definitely within the session itself, we have to be careful with how how we are approaching our training so that we can maximize the stimulus over multiple sets and not be compromised by the degree of fatigue we are also incurring, right? So that's my thought process. And I gave a presentation the other day in Singapore. I kind of laid out like an example workout, and I showed the audience how I would prescribe, sets, reps, and RIR, etc. And I kind of mentioned exactly what I've spoken to you about now. If I was starting a session off with a leg press, I'd keep 2 to 3, reps in reserve, just as a broad and very brief kind of example. I think that would still be sufficient enough to promote muscle hypertrophy on those sets based on what we already know from the literature. But it's not really going to affect like my my split squat to a great extent on the next set. Of course, there's going to be some carryover, but I'm still going to walk into my next exercise, whether that be a split squat, a single leg press, a Smith machine lunge, whatever it might be. I'm still going to be able to walk into that exercise using close to the, like, for example, right? If I'm starting off a session with a leg press and then the second exercise is a single leg press. On that single leg press, let's say if I was fresh on that single leg press, so I was fresh and I was starting the session off with that exercise, maybe for 12 reps, like the maximum load I would use is like 100 kilos, like 12 reps, 0 RIR, right? I want to be able to walk into that single leg press, which is based on this example, the second exercise, and I want to use a load that is as close to that 100 kilos as possible. Right? If I'm so fatigued that I walk into that single leg press and I'm now using 70 kilos, when really, if it was the first exercise, I could be using 100, I'm likely not getting as much out of that exercise as I possibly could. Right? Now, of course, we're always going to have to accept some degree of fatigue. Totally. But we at least want to try and limit it to some extent so that we can perform multiple exercises in a row and be close to, I guess, the maximum, and be close to acquiring the maximal force production we possibly could on those exercises, right? That's kind of my fundamental idea and thought process that underlies how I program for my clients.
Well, I feel like too, this shows that like what you do at one point is going to affect what you can do later, right? And it's not like you can just go into a training session and just do whatever you want all the time. Like, there's going to be this like point where it's like, okay, if you put a lot into one exercise, like you said, you train to failure on every set on it, it's like that is going to affect what you can do later on. So like, again, you can't just go in and just do whatever, because you're not going to get the best result out of that. Like, you're going to essentially at some point be doing, I guess, what we would call like junk volume at that point, if you don't, if you're not careful of these things. So
Sure.
I guess my question to you then is like, if for somebody that would sometimes does see like their reps drop from say set to set, right? Is that something that would be concerning to you? Do you think maybe you are maybe training too hard at the beginning, or is that something that you do commonly see where, like, for example, it's like, let's say it's 6 to 10 rep range, maybe set one, they get 10 reps and then it goes down to 7, 6. Do you think that they are accumulating too much fatigue at that point? Or is that something that you will see so long as you're following like the RAR? That's really what is the most important there.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I think that makes for a really interesting discussion. And I'm still formulating my thoughts and ideas when it comes to answering a question like that. I think that's a very practical question, because in practice, that's one way we can assess fatigue, is by looking at the repetition drop off from set to set. Now, I'll give you one example and then I'll give you another. If you do 4 sets of 12, right, and you are rating those sets as a 0 RIR or a 1 RIR, I'm going to be a little bit skeptical about that RIR prediction. Right? We should be at least seeing some rep drop off, unless you're like, I had some participants, right, who were able to maintain their reps very well across some sets and then they eventually dropped off. Some participants will be quite resistant to fatigue, and that's fine. But most people should see at least some drop off if they're pushing close to failure. So I guess that's one example. If we look at another example, though, if we have someone who goes from 12 to 10 to 8 to 6 upon training to a 0-1 RIR, which I saw in my experiment, why do we, like, I can maybe propose a question to you, like, why do we see that rep drop off? Like, what is exactly leading to that drop off in reps over the course of sets?
Maybe under resting in between, or just, I mean, I guess at that point, I would just imagine just too much fatigue at that point, if you are seeing that.
Yes, correct. And fatigue is a decrease in force production from what you could, like, if that's your maximal force production, if that's your baseline, fatigue is simply a decrease in your ability to produce force.
Right.
So what we're seeing here is an individual who is now producing less force across multiple sets. And if internal force production is mechanical tension, that's what we're after, then arguably, if we're going from 12 to 9, to 8 to 6, we're kind of getting less out of each subsequent set, right? We're not producing the force that we could otherwise produce if maybe we rested longer, right? So that's a very, I guess, practical takeaway. If I see someone's reps dropping drastically, and it's just a bit of a red flag in my mind, I'm probably going to tell this individual to rest longer, right? Because their individual fatigability just simply necessitates more rest in between sets if we're training to like a 1 RIR based on the example that I'm giving here. So I think in practice, although we are eventually going to see a rep drop off, especially if we're doing like 4 or 5 sets on an exercise, we should be trying to at least preserve our reps, because if we're preserving reps, then we can also say we're likely maintaining high force production, close to what we could maximally do. You're never going to be at that maximum point because you're always going to have that cloud of fatigue lingering. But from my perspective, we should be at least trying to preserve our reps. And we do that with rest periods, right? And that's probably one of the reasons why longer rest periods seem to be better than shorter rest periods for hypertrophy. They allow for sustained force production, which is close to maximal over multiple sets. And of course, some exercises are more fatiguing than other exercises, right?
Right.
And so the rest period has to be dependent on the exercise and its characteristics. And so that's the way I see it playing out. So, when I speak to clients, I'm like, hey, if you're training hard enough, you're likely going to experience some drop off in reps. But look, if we're only doing 3 sets on this exercise, I want you to try your best to preserve your reps. I don't want to see a massive drop off. So make sure you rest long enough to ensure you go into each and every set, with being close to fully recovered, and being at a point where you're confident you can push real hard and get close to the number of reps you did on the first set, right? And then that way, hopefully, we go into each subsequent exercise also being, fresh enough to lift, close to the maximal load we could lift for a certain number of reps, based on the example I gave you earlier with like the single leg press. Again, that I'm still formulating my ideas in this
Yeah.
regard, but that's the way I see it playing out, and that's the lens I look through when I'm programming for my clients and I'm having these discussions with them.
Yeah. So really, it sounds like like you said, there's likely for some people going to be some potential like drop off. It's just when it's kind of this like massive drop off from that first to the last set. Again, you're talking like
Yeah.
from 12 to 6 reps. It's like, okay,
Mhm.
something's off somewhere, right? Because the reason I bring that up, and this is more so my training, is I have noticed as I've done RAR training, I have noticed that more where like that first set, I do get a little bit more reps. And then as the sets go
Mhm.
on, I do find that the reps will drop down a little bit. Like one that
Yep.
really I see will drop off is like triceps, for example. Like that one, I don't
Mhm.
know if there's any,
Mhm.
I'm sure it's dependent on the muscle
Yep.
group and whatnot, but
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just
yeah.
kind of wanted to run that by you to hear your thoughts after running this study on that. So
Yeah, totally. So it would be muscle group dependent. It would be exercise dependent, exercise order as well. So many moving parts, and that's why like I'm trying to keep kind of my statements here quite broad and
absolutely.
simple, because I think they can, that what I said can be applied right in practice. Um, and I gave a presentation the other day, and I spoke about how when we're programming for hypertrophy, we need to kind of think about, well, how can we maximize the stimulus we achieve per rep, per set, per session, per week, and per mesocycle, right? And again, if we kind of use that lens and we think about all the things that I said earlier, we should be able to design a program that is sufficiently hard to promote hypertrophy. And when I say hard in this regard, I'm saying, well, we're training close to failure consistently enough over time to promote hypertrophy, but we're also limiting some of the neuromuscular fatigue that we know can compromise our ability to produce force and may interfere or at least interact with the mechanical tension we're also achieving across reps, sets, workouts, weeks, mesocycles, etc.
Yeah, no, I love that because, like you said, it's again, I think people just think they just think about like that one set they're doing or that one rep.
Yes,
When again, we have to
exactly.
zoom out and like make sure you're again, like you said, if you were
Yeah.
doing one workout a week and it was one set, like you would just go to like you
Yeah.
would go to failure, right? But you have to
Yes.
consider everything else that you're doing, and again,
Yeah.
trying to figure out what that best, how far away
Hmm.
from failure that is, and again to fit the whole thing in. So I
Yeah.
love that. I guess then
Yeah.
I don't know if there was anything else that you maybe wanted to cover on this study that the audience could take away. And I guess to finish it up, where do you kind of see this going here
Hmm.
in the near future?
Hmm. Yeah, I guess before I answer that, I just also want to say that being hyper focused on any one variable is likely a bottleneck to your training journey, whether that be being hyper focused on each individual rep, being hyper focused on the set, the session. You really need to be able to consider all these variables and their interactions as a coach, to program in the best way possible for a client. And again, the client, if you're out there coaching yourself, you need to be able to zoom out and think about how your training is playing out over time, not just being hyper focused on one variable. Some people, it's just tech. It's just every rep making sure the technique is absolutely perfect, right? But that might come with a limitation. Well, what about your proximity to failure? Are you pushing hard enough? Right? What about your program design as a whole? Right? Are you ticking boxes across the board? This goes for everything. That's just one brief example. It's important to zoom out and not be hyper focused on just the one thing. Um, so yeah, I think regarding the study, I think regarding my experimental study, that's I think that was a good overview of it all. And if you're interested, if you're out there listening and you're interested, stay tuned. I'm hoping to publish that in the coming months, and of course, if you read through it, you'll have even more insight. And I think it's really promising, because if more studies, more researchers start employing the methods that I described earlier, in future years, we're going to have a lot more research that we can use to guide our decision making. And of course, we can't just look at neuromuscular fatigue. We need to look at other outcome measures as well, because at the end of the day, I'm interested in practical outcomes. So, for example, next year I want to run a longer term intervention. I want to see how things play out over the course of 8, to 10 weeks. Right. When you're trained to failure, when you're keeping, 2 reps in reserve, how do things play out over the course of time? Right. Is the muscle growth the same between groups, right? Training to different proximities to failure. What about the cumulative neuromuscular fatigue over time? In the study I described earlier, it was just acute, really.
Yeah.
And, in the days subsequent to resistance training. But I'm not sure about you, Jeff. If you get close to the end of a, 6 to 8 week training program, you start feeling pretty beaten up, right? So it's very common to hear people say that fatigue accumulates, right? So I want to know more about that as well. And I think if we can take these methods that I described, that I employed in this acute study, and employ them over a longer term intervention, in coming years, we're going to have, a lot more data that we can use to inform what we do in the gym. Because again, like in that scoping review, I concluded that, hey, training to failure all the time doesn't seem to be better than non-failure training. Right? It's unlikely to be superior to non-failure training. But non-failure training can mean so many different things, and we need to be more specific with the way we design studies and conduct them, so that we can actually look at the results and provide robust practical recommendations. That's really the main, I guess, thesis of my PhD is steering research in that direction and trying to bridge the gap between research and practice. And I think we can bridge that gap with scientific thinking. If we're able to interpret studies in a scientific way, and we're able to employ a scientific viewpoint, and this means a scientific viewpoint can mean many things, but there's many traits that underlie a scientific viewpoint, right? You first need to have respect for evidence. You need to have logical coherence, curiosity, right? Intellectual honesty. You need to be able to formulate ideas for and against. This is the scientific viewpoint that I'm describing, right? It's an open-minded, it's a non-absolute viewpoint. If we can use that, to interpret research and to make it as practical as possible, well, I think that's how we bridge the gap between research and practice.
And it takes time too. It takes a long time to find answers to
Hmm.
things as well too. It's going to take
Hmm.
time, but yeah, no, I love that. I think too, it's not getting caught up in like one way of thinking as well too. That's one way to
Hmm.
do it as well too. So awesome, Martin. Really appreciate the review on everything. I think this will be super helpful for a lot of people. So I guess before I let you go, is there anything that you want to let the audience know about, and or where they
Yep.
can find out more
Yeah,
about you?
for sure. So if you're interested in all these things I'm discussing, stay tuned. Meta-analysis should be published soon. Uh, the paper that I'm talking about regarding the acute study I conducted earlier, that should be published in the coming months as well. So the best place to follow me to stay up to date with all of that would be Instagram. So MR Fitness on Instagram, and also all the JPS pages. So JPS Health and Fitness, JPS Education. We are doing a lot of seminars and courses, which you might be interested in, that I play a role in as well. So be sure to check us out there. And if you have any questions, if you want to know more, if you want to read some of the papers I published, be sure to reach out. I'm here to help. I want to answer questions. I want to have these discussions, and I want to I guess foster a yeah a discussion with people that can help move the industry forward. An open-minded discussion, that we can all have to try and get closer to the truth. Really, that's what I'm after here.
Awesome. Cool, Martin. Well, again, appreciate your time, and we'll have you on again here in the future.
No worries. Thanks, Jeff.